On that stormy night, when a mighty wind was pounding against the living room windows and casting lively shadows on the walls, suddenly the sound of the doorbell made us shiver. A penetrating and insistent sound, like a moan from the darkness. Someone, with deep despair, as if seeking salvation, was incessantly pressing the bell. An indescribable anxiety sparked in me. I was sure it was Lili, Leo's wife, at the door. A woman who had turned peace into a storm since her arrival in our family. Now, years had passed, and their life with a 4-year-old son was still a source of unrest. I, Mia, the youngest of a 6-member family, stood at the center of this storm with my twin, Lucas. And now, with that terrifying sound of the bell, it felt as if a curtain of secrets was being lifted, revealing hidden truths of the night. A night that could unveil the most shocking family secrets. Lucas and I were twins, and I was born 5 minutes after him. Leo and Emily had a 5-year age gap, and Emily was 2 years older than Lucas and me. Lucas had recently gotten married, and it hadn't even been a month when, suddenly, his wife got angry and went back to her father's house. Frustrated, Mom picked up the intercom and left it on so Lili would get tired and give up. Leo had instructed us not to answer her to avoid a fight. Their argument was about Lili finding a woman's number on my brother's phone, receiving love messages from her, which escalated the fight, and Leo ended up raising his hand against her. Indeed, Leo was not at fault, and that woman was the one sending him messages. But Lili made a fuss, leading to a complaint and a forensic examination, enforcing her dowry. Since then, Leo had been laying low. Despite Dad's efforts to talk to this girl to compromise, it was futile. On the other hand, Ella, our newlywed, was upset because my brother had scolded her. The issue was about buying wedding rings. They said they didn't have money, so my brother paid for them. It's always been this way, because we were financially well off, everyone took advantage of us. It turned out that Ella had money in her account, and the dispute over the ring payment escalated their argument. It hadn't even been a week since Lucas's wedding when he dropped Ella off at her father's house. My parents tried several times to bring her back, but she refused, demanding that something be transferred to her name, fearing divorce from Lucas. Her dowry wasn't as hefty as Lili's, which was substantial. Our house was in disarray, with Lili and Ella joining forces and wreaking havoc. My sister Emily, who has a 7-year-old daughter named Parmiz and a 3-year-old son named David, is busy with her home and children but is always worried about us. She calls constantly to check if anything new has happened, and Mom reassures her to focus on her life. Lili, in frustration, kicked and pounded on our door and eventually gave up and left when she saw it was futile. Mom, overwhelmed by stress, felt unwell, so I made her some sugared water and cursed Lili. I was furious, thinking aloud about how audacious and impudent Lili was to not want my brother but still demand his money. We were well off, but that didn't mean others should take advantage. My mother, annoyed by my loud rants, asked me to be quiet. I was tired of the constant fights, arguments, and tension caused by a mere phone number. I remembered how Dad had tried to convince Lili to compromise for the sake of the child, even willing to get a written commitment from Leo to not air again, but she wouldn't budge, insisting on divorce. She had turned us all against each other, forcing my brother to flee the city and live a hidden, nomadic life. It had been a long time since he had seen his child, Arsam, and we hadn't seen him either. Mom missed him dearly. Lucas was also deeply troubled, sending messages to Ella without reply. Emily, always worried about us, would call every day, talking for hours with Mom, and eventually hanging up after a lot of crying. One night, when we were all together, seeing Lucas's restlessness, Dad decided for the 1000th time to go to Ella's house and try our best to bring her back. Angrily, I said I didn't understand why we were tolerating so much from these two. If Lucas had been less attentive and ignored Ella, she would have come back. When I said this, Lucas got defensive, but Mom intervened and told me not to meddle, reminding me that Dad was present. Seeing Dad's frown, I lowered my head, stayed silent, and didn't say another word. But Lucas kept threatening me, saying, "I'm watching you, your tongue has gotten too long, I'll set you straight." I tried to control myself, not wanting to worsen the situation. It was always like this, both of them sided with their women, unable to tolerate the truth. It's true what they say, the truth is bitter. After much provocation, I lost my patience and retorted, "Why do you always side with Ella? She doesn't even care about you. She left without looking back, and here you are, upset about her absence." Lucas, extremely angry, came towards me, presumably to argue. Seeing how bad things were and knowing it would only get worse if I didn't leave, I quickly ran to my room and locked the door. As usual, my parents supported their son and blamed me. I could hear them outside, deciding to go to Ella's father's house and persuade her to come back. Then Dad called Ella's father, insisting on a meeting the next evening. The next night, they dressed up and went to fetch Ella. It wasn't long before Dad, Mom, and Lucas returned, looking disheveled and distressed. All three were frustrated. My heart felt lighter. I couldn't help but smirk, which didn't escape Lucas's notice. Suddenly, he appeared right in front of me. Lucas, in his rage about Ella not returning and the events of the previous night, cornered me in a way that I couldn't escape. He grabbed me and hit me so hard that I felt my bones breaking. My parents intervened, scolding me for provoking him. I was heartbroken for myself, wondering why I should suffer such merciless beating without having said a word. Mom pushed me into my room, arguing. I cried bitterly, hurt by how I was treated over something so trivial. Mom finally calmed Lucas down. I spent the night upset and woke up with severe body pain, angry at everyone, especially myself. Emily, upon hearing what happened, couldn't bear it and came to our house. She burst into tears at the doorstep, cursing whoever brought misfortune into our lives. When she saw Lucas, she became overly sympathetic, saying she couldn't bear to see him like this. A few minutes later, Emily entered my room, hugged me, and comforted me, telling me not to be upset. She said Lucas was devastated and I shouldn't take his actions to heart. Her words soothed me, and we went out to have breakfast together. Ella had demanded the house be transferred in her name as a condition for her return. Lucas was torn between not wanting to give in and being emotionally drained. Dad was angry, suggesting Ella should stay at her father's house. Mom was also very upset, struggling with the situation. A few days passed, and we were still dealing with the issues involving our two daughters-in-law and their families. Then one day, Lili called, saying Arsum missed us and she would bring him to see us. We were happy, thinking she wanted to reconcile, but Dad was suspicious, questioning why she would suddenly change her mind. When Lili arrived, she seemed like her old self, expressing regret over her actions. She even inquired about Leo's whereabouts, but Dad signaled us not to say anything, not even to give her his number. Lili, noticing Dad's reaction, shrugged and said she understood our lack of trust. She claimed that once she forgave the dowry and withdrew her complaint, we would see her intention for peace. We still had to be cautious and consider all aspects, especially to avoid getting my brother into trouble. Lili and Arsum stayed with us until evening, and though we insisted they stay the night, Lili declined and left. After they were gone, Dad wondered aloud about her sudden change of heart, given that she had seemed reluctant to leave just moments before. Mom, while clearing the dishes, chided him for always being suspicious. That night, Mom called Leo and told him about Lili's visit. Leo, like Dad, was suspicious. He said he would only return if she withdrew her complaint and forgave the dowry completely. He also demanded that she make a commitment in front of everyone and agree to certain conditions. I agreed with my brother's stance. How could Lili behave this way, especially over a phone number that had no real significance? A couple of days after Lili's visit, we were invited to dinner at my aunt's house. Several days passed, and although Mom and Dad weren't in the mood for socializing, we occasionally attended or hosted gatherings to lift Lucas's spirits. I was getting ready in my room when Lucas entered, asking if I could fix his tie. As I approached him with the tie, a scream from Mom startled us both. Fearing something had happened to Dad, we rushed to their room. We found Dad sitting on the bed, hands on his head, and Mom had fainted in the middle of the room. Lucas took Mom in his arms, and I hurried to the kitchen to prepare some sugared water for her. While mixing the sugar and water, I returned to the room and managed to give it to Mom. As she regained her composure, I noticed the empty safe. Mom always kept valuable items in there, including gold bars, jewelry, and dollars. I was devastated, realizing that everything was gone. Lili had stolen all the gold and dollars. She had crafted an entire scenario to achieve her goal. How could someone be so deceitful and heartless? We had trusted her, welcomed her into our home, but she exploited our trust. We were all so upset that Dad canceled the dinner party. The house was submerged in a dreadful silence, each of us lost in thought, reflecting on the betrayal we had experienced. Dad was the most affected. He wanted to report to the police, but Mom and Emily dissuaded him. When Mom called Lili, she shamelessly claimed it was her right, even saying it was only half of her dowry. Mom angrily responded. Lili accused us of being the wrongdoers, even though she was the one who should have been apologetic. I wished I could take the phone and say everything I wanted to her. After that incident, no matter how much my parents tried to reason with Lili, hoping she'd drop her complaint now that she had reached her goal, she remained adamant. She insisted she wouldn't withdraw the complaint until Leo granted her a divorce and she secured custody of Arsum. We were at a loss for what to do. One night, exhausted from dealing with our two daughters-in-law, we made a reckless decision to scare them into submission. We planned to drive by their houses, possibly even run them over, or at least intimidate them enough to make them back down. We first went to Lili's place, but despite waiting and watching, she didn't appear. Mom, suspecting something, kept calling and texting us, making us reconsider our plan. We abandoned the idea of confronting Ella and returned home. It felt like our home was cursed. No matter what we did, we couldn't find a way out. Neither Ella nor Lili was willing to compromise. Leo, tired of being on the run, feared returning and getting arrested. Mom's health was deteriorating from the constant stress, now suffering from leg and back pain, constantly in distress. I had become the punching bag for everyone's frustrations, and I couldn't hold back either. Our arguments escalated. The atmosphere at home was charged with tension and anger. I despised Ella and Lili, often wishing I could erase them from my brothers' lives or turn back time to prevent these marriages. Lili, with her substantial dowry, had the upper hand, but Ella, with her modest dowry, was equally troublesome. Time passed, and Leo, unable to hide any longer, returned and was immediately arrested. Lili stood her ground, winning custody of their child and agreeing to forgive the dowry in exchange for the divorce. A hefty compensation was also set for her, given that she had been a victim of Leo's physical abuse. After that incident, my parents kept trying to convince Lili to drop her complaint, but she wouldn't budge until Leo agreed to divorce her and give her custody of Arsum. We didn't know what to do. One night, out of sheer frustration with both daughters-in-law, we impulsively considered scaring them by driving past their houses, but we eventually abandoned this reckless idea. Eventually, the divorce between Lili and Leo was finalized, and it was agreed that Arsum would visit us weekly to see his father. Leo rented out his house and moved back in with us. While Leo and Lucas got along from a distance, they often argued when together, both being stubborn and proud. Dad decided we should do whatever it took to persuade Ella to return to Lucas. He sold our house, bought a 3-story apartment building, and transferred the deed of a garden to Ella's name. This convinced her to return. One apartment was given to Leo, and the other to Ella and Lucas. Leo's behavior became increasingly erratic. He often came home late and slept through the day, only going to work sporadically. He turned his apartment into a party hub with alcohol, drugs, loud music, and dancing, which disturbed Lucas and Ella, especially since their apartments were adjacent. Mom thought getting Leo married would solve his problems, but he refused. His behavior worsened, and he frequently clashed with Lucas. Dad opposed the idea of Leo remarrying, fearing any new wife would soon leave him due to his behavior. Lucas and Leo's constant conflicts were troubling, and we often sympathized with Lili for leading Leo. Mom still hoped a new marriage would settle Leo down, but both Leo and Dad were against the idea. Ella, too, was reluctant to join us, even avoiding Mom's visits. Amidst all this chaos, I had 2 suitors, but the situation with both of my suitors was so dismal that I couldn't bring myself to accept either of them. I feared that my situation would worsen if I did. However, the constant stress and conflicts at home made me occasionally consider saying yes just to escape, but I always ended up changing my mind. One suitor had already divorced 3 wives and had a very low social status. The other came from a very low-level family. So, we were stuck with each other at home, amidst constant fights between Leo and Lucas, Lucas and Ella, or my mom and me with Ella. My dad even had a serious argument with me a few times because I spoke the truth to Ella. I understood he was trying to keep the peace with his daughter-in-law, so I wasn't offended. One day, after a particularly heated argument between me and Dad about Ella's complaints, Mom couldn't stand it anymore. The next day, in the absence of Lucas and Dad, she unleashed her fury on Ella, cursing her and wishing she had never become part of our family. Even though Lucas tried to apologize and calm things down, Ella remained stubborn, leading to more shouting and arguments. Once, Mom and I decided to have a serious confrontation with Ella, intending to scare her into changing her behavior. However, things got out of hand, and Ella got hurt, leading to more tensions and arguments, especially when Ella's family got involved. Despite our pleas for them not to interfere, they did, which only made things worse. Our disputes became even more heated and extended to both families. Then one night, Leo held another loud party with his friends, complete with alcohol and loud music, which lasted until the early hours. Despite Lucas's repeated warnings to end the party, Leo ignored him. For the first time, Lucas called the police, but the situation was resolved through Dad's intervention. However, our reputation in the neighborhood was severely damaged. The next morning, a heated argument between Leo and Lucas woke us up. Despite my urging Mom not to intervene, she couldn't resist and ended up escalating the situation. Leo, in his anger, demanded his inheritance, threatening to leave. This became a recurring issue. Whenever we confronted Leo about his behavior, he would bring up his inheritance. Selling the house wasn't an option due to financial losses. One day, Leo caused a huge scene, breaking everything within reach. Lucas wasn't home at the time, but when he returned and saw the chaos, I could see the rage building up in him. He stormed upstairs, and moments later, we heard shouting, Ella's screams, and a heavy thud. Our worst fears had materialized. Leo lay bleeding, gravely injured. Mom was hysterical, Dad was in shock, and the neighbors rushed in, calling the police. Initially, we thought it was an accident, but the police investigation revealed it was intentional. Lucas confessed that he had wanted to remove this disgrace from our lives permanently. I couldn't believe Lucas would do something like this, especially in front of our parents. He was arrested in front of our neighbors, not showing any remorse. Ella, a witness to the event, packed her bags and left after the interrogations. Despite Dad's pleas, she refused to stay, saying someone who could harm his own brother wouldn't hesitate to hurt a stranger like her. Ella had seen Leo struggling for his life and Lucas showing no mercy, pushing him out of the window. Leo, weakened by addiction, couldn't defend himself or survive the fall. Remembering my brother's face filled me with anguish. Reflecting on that fateful moment, I wish I had accompanied Lucas, perhaps preventing the tragedy. Deep down, I was angry with him, only speaking a few cold words during visits to prison, compelled by Dad's insistence. Mom was even more distraught. She couldn't forgive Lucas, yet the thought of losing another son to prison was unbearable. Despite everything, they were both still my brothers. Our situation was dire, and Ella's divorce proceedings added to our distress. I empathized with her. Witnessing such a horrific act would terrify anyone. Not having seen it myself, I still suffered from nightmares, waking up in terror. Ella, understandably frightened, had every right to leave. Dad hired a lawyer for Lucas, attempting to handle the legal proceedings. Our household was overwhelmed with grief for Leo, anxiety over Lucas's imprisonment, and the looming divorce of Ella. The house was steeped in sadness and silence, leaving us uncertain whether to mourn for Leo or grieve for Lucas's predicament. Mom and Dad were visibly declining day by day. Emily's husband constantly blamed her for our family's disgrace. The scene reconstruction brought more humiliation, and we were ostracized by neighbors and acquaintances. We became pariahs, avoided by everyone, even ignored on the phone. Eventually, Leo's body was released for burial, and we laid him to rest, alone and desolate. Our isolation and loneliness were palpable. Everyone's attitude towards us had changed. They distanced themselves, turning away from us. Dad found no solace even at work. Dad spent a fortune on legal fees to commute Lucas's death sentence to imprisonment, as we weren't pressing charges. Meanwhile, Ella pursued her divorce. I couldn't fathom how she could abandon Lucas in such a dire situation. I understood fear, but Lucas had committed the crime for her. The house no longer felt like a home. Sometimes, I felt as if Leo's tormented spirit lingered, recalling tales where the souls of murder victims remain restless until their vengeance is fulfilled. Those days were filled with horror, haunted by nightmares of an angry Leo. In the aftermath, I experienced a terrifying nightmare where an earthquake swallowed my family into the ground, and I was desperately digging to rescue them, alone and unaided, while passers-by merely sneered. Emily, who maintained only phone contact with us, was forbidden by her husband from visiting our home tainted by unjust blood. His harsh words wounded us deeply. We were exhausted from being judged and ostracized but had no choice but to endure. We grieved for Leo and Lucas's predicament simultaneously. Poor little Arsum, too young to lose his father. Whenever we visited Lucas in prison, it was clear how much he missed Ella, but she remained unyielding. Eventually, Ella forgave the dowry and finalized the divorce, and on the day of the decree, her mother cursed our family. Lucas received a 3-year sentence and additional punishment. The atmosphere at home became so unbearable that Dad decided to move. The memories of Leo's death haunted every corner of the house. I could see his face everywhere. But selling the house proved difficult. No one wanted a property where a deliberate murder occurred. Even renting it out wasn't an option. We decided to move elsewhere temporarily. Mom was so distressed she didn't even want to take her belongings, each item reminding her of Leo. Emily never visited, perhaps under pressure from her husband's family. Even after Lucas's release, she stayed away, her husband forbidding any contact and not wanting to associate with a murderer. Emily's and Lucas's estrangement lasted 3 years, a testament to the deep scars our family's tragedy had left. After the incident, Arsum stopped visiting us, depriving us of the last connection we had with Leo. While I managed to cope, it was particularly hard for Mom and Dad. We stayed in a rental house for a while, and when we couldn't sell our old house, we eventually moved back, despite the improvement in our mental state being only marginal. Returning home reignited gossip and judgment about how we could live in a house where such a tragedy occurred. Nobody could truly understand our situation, and we were judged from every angle. The 2 suitors I had, already not ideal, were scared away by Lucas's actions. The judgments and gossip weighed heavily on my heart. We were constantly bombarded with criticism and didn't know what to do. As time passed, Mom was keen on finding a wife for Lucas, but every marriage proposal ended in rejection as soon as they learned about our family's past. Even if they initially entertained the proposal, they would quickly decline upon discovering the truth. So, we resorted to lying, claiming our dad accidentally killed my brother in a fight, and Lucas took the blame to save him from prison. We even omitted mentioning his previous marriage, but still, no one was willing to marry him. Then one day, Dad mentioned meeting a simple, seemingly naive father and daughter while working. They appeared completely oblivious to our family's notoriety. Mom immediately suggested considering the daughter for Lucas. Dad thought about it and agreed, saying we might be able to deceive them about our past. Eventually, Dad managed to arrange a marriage proposal with a family that seemed quite naive. When Dad explained that he had accidentally killed his son in a family dispute, and Lucas took the blame to protect him, the girl's family easily accepted this fabricated story. Mom was initially against lying about our past, but Dad insisted it was necessary, fearing the truth might reach them otherwise. Though some might criticize us for this deception, we were desperate to settle Lucas's life. Emma's family, perhaps eager to marry off their daughter who hadn't had any suitors before, didn't question our story. They didn't conduct any background checks or seek out Ella to verify the facts. Mom was relieved by their lack of investigation and saw it as a positive sign, believing it was God's doing to ensure Lucas's happiness. The engagement and wedding happened quickly, within just 2 months. After the wedding, Dad demolished the apartments of Leo and Lucas and built a new unit for the newlyweds to provide them a fresh start. We brought Emma to our home, and Lucas didn't let her go back to her family's house. I understood his concern for his new life, but Mom was constantly whispering to Lucas about starting a family soon. Their life hadn't yet settled down, and their home was still under construction when Emma announced her pregnancy. Her family was shocked, but we were overjoyed, grateful for Lucas's chance at happiness. We did everything we could to ensure their happiness, but Lucas's difficult personality made it challenging for me, his sister, to tolerate at times. I tried my best to befriend Emma and support her like a sister, always taking her side. Lucas had imposed severe restrictions on her, not allowing her to go anywhere or maintain contact with her old friends. I understood Lucas's fear of losing her, but Emma's tolerance for his controlling and distrustful behavior was understandably limited, especially during her pregnancy. She was confined at home without the opportunity to even go out for fresh air. Despite our suggestions that a pregnant woman needs sunlight and fresh air, Lucas wouldn't listen. My mother and I felt sorry for Emma. Her own family seemed indifferent to her situation. Emma became so depressed that she would just sit in a corner and cry all day, which broke my heart, but there was little I could do. Emma's innocence and vulnerability worried me. I feared the consequences of her despair. During one of their arguments, I overheard Lucas cruelly reminding Emma that no one else had wanted to marry her, even referring to her cousin, Thomas, who was bald and a psychologist. Thomas had proposed to Emma once but didn't pursue it after she declined. Lucas used this fact to hurt Emma, implying she had been desperate to accept him. Emma was deeply hurt by this. Crying, she lamented why she had to bear a child with him, declaring her hatred for him and the unborn baby. Her pain was palpable, and it was heartbreaking to witness her emotional turmoil. When Lucas stormed out of the house, he told Mom he was heading north and demanded that Emma be gone by the time he returned, declaring he no longer wanted to continue their relationship. Despite Mom's efforts, she couldn't stop him. I couldn't understand Lucas. On one hand, he was afraid of losing Emma, but on the other, his actions were jeopardizing their marriage. It seemed like he was struggling with deep-seated psychological issues. That same night, he sent a message to Emma's elder sister, causing further embarrassment and turmoil. After Lucas left, I took Emma into my care, but she was inconsolable, crying until dawn. The next day, her mother and sister visited her briefly, and their indifference astounded me. They simply told us to take good care of Emma before leaving. A week passed with no word from Lucas. He didn't answer our calls or contact us. Dad had some acquaintances in the north, but Lucas hadn't visited any of them. We became sure he hadn't actually gone north, possibly not even leaving the city. He had taken no luggage, and his name wasn't on any travel lists. He couldn't have flown, given his fear of heights. He always preferred buses for our family trips. When Lucas finally returned after a week, we were all furious with him for abandoning his pregnant wife. He wouldn't say where he had been, consumed with thoughts, anger, and frustration. I was personally afraid to ask him anything or confront him about his actions. The situation in our house was tense and filled with unspoken questions and fears about the future of Lucas and Emma's relationship, as well as the well-being of their unborn child. Lucas returned home, and the cycle of daily arguments and violence resumed. Emma was constantly subjected to his verbal and physical abuse. Whenever I tried to intervene, Mom stopped me, insisting we shouldn't get involved. We witnessed Emma's suffering and Lucas's aggression every day. After Leo's death, Lucas's mental state had deteriorated, and we had hoped that marrying Emma would improve his condition, but it only worsened. The resemblance between Lucas and Leo, who were almost like twins, made the situation even more painful. Lucas's strict control over Emma, not allowing her to go anywhere or interact with others, further isolated her. Even visits to her family were scarce and heavily monitored by Lucas. I was frustrated with Lucas's behavior and how he mistreated Emma, who was terrified of him. Any small mistake on her part would lead to a night of turmoil, and no amount of reasoning from us about her pregnancy and the need for a stress-free environment would get through to him. One morning, after another argument, Lucas angrily decided to take Emma back to her parents' house against her will. When I tried to stop him, he physically assaulted me as well. Shaken by his actions, I lashed out, calling him cowardly for abusing a pregnant woman. He left with Emma, but not before threatening me. Emma called me later, worried about my well-being, which only deepened my sympathy for her innocence and vulnerability. A few days later, Dad talked to Lucas, trying to calm him down. Lucas was supposed to go and bring Emma back, but his pride wouldn't allow it. He told Emma to return on her own, which she did, as usual, conceding to his demands. Sometimes I wondered about Emma's constant compliance. Could a person really demean themselves so much? I had seen several times that even when Lucas was at fault, Emma would apologize to him. The situation in our house was becoming increasingly unbearable, with constant fear, tension, and the looming threat of Lucas's unpredictable behavior. Emma's plight and her resignation to her fate were deeply troubling. Throughout this period, we witnessed Emma's ongoing struggles with Lucas. Despite my efforts to be her ally and support her, the situation was complex and challenging. Lucas's behavior towards Emma was increasingly aggressive and controlling. He restricted her movements and interactions, even with her own family. The constant conflicts and abuse were distressing for everyone involved. The question lingered why Emma had agreed so quickly to marry Lucas. Perhaps she had her own issues or insecurities, or maybe she felt pressure due to her family's eagerness. On the other hand, Lucas's happiness in his marriage was questionable. Despite his quarrels with Ella, there were moments of laughter and joy. But with Emma, it was different. The relationship seemed fraught with more tension and less happiness. I often pondered if Emma might have had some flaws or issues that led her to accept Lucas so readily. It seemed she was always the one apologizing and conceding in their arguments, which was perplexing. Her tolerance and resilience in the face of constant mistreatment were astonishing, sometimes making me wonder if she herself had underlying problems for accepting such treatment. The noise of their fights and Emma's cries often left us exhausted. I would question Mom's decision to rush Lucas into this marriage, thinking we might have been better off without these constant disturbances. I felt guilty seeing Lucas mistreat his pregnant wife and feared for the unborn child's well-being amid such stress. Despite the chaos and complexity of the situation, we tried to find moments of humor and lightness. When Mom would humorously speculate about the baby's appearance, it would involuntarily make me laugh, albeit with a hint of fear and apprehension about the future of this unborn child in such a turbulent environment. As days passed in the same tumultuous pattern, everyone's nerves were frayed. Emma, increasingly isolated and depressed, was confined to the house as Lucas didn't allow her any social interactions. Mom tried to change Emma's mood by hosting a few gatherings, but Lucas's disapproval limited Emma's participation. I sometimes wondered if Lucas had seen something in Emma to justify his strictness. Emma was nearing the end of her pregnancy, and amidst this, a suitor appeared for me, a 40-year-old man who had never married and worked in car painting. I quickly accepted his proposal, and our engagement coincided with Emma's sister's engagement ceremony. After marrying David, I was caught up with my new life and had less time to focus on Emma and Lucas's problems. However, David's family was overly curious about my brother Leo's passing, which irritated me, making me avoid spending time with them. Amidst this, Emma went into labor, and we rushed to the hospital. The sight of Emma's family crying was distressing, so I distanced myself and sat away from them. Emma gave birth to a boy, whom Lucas named Samiyar, reminding me of Arsam, now 10 years old, whom I hadn't seen in a long time. I hoped Samiyar's fate would be different from Arsam's and that he would grow up under his parents' care. After spending the night with Emma, witnessing her pain and suffering, I left the hospital with David. The weather was warm, so David bought some cool fruit juice on the way home. At his house, I shared the news of Samiyar's birth with his family, feeling an immense love for the newborn. The days after Emma's return home with her newborn, Samiyar, were filled with a semblance of joy that had been missing in our lives. Lucas seemed genuinely happy, a sight that filled me with hope for lasting happiness in our family. Around the time Samiyar turned 3 months old, David's family came over to set a date for our wedding, and everything was arranged swiftly. The ceremony was held at David's house, marking the beginning of my married life. At 31, I was considered a late bloomer in terms of marriage by societal standards of the time. Living in the upper floor of David's family home, I quickly found myself struggling with the intrusive and critical behavior of my mother-in-law. She would frequently enter our home without knocking, critiquing everything from my cooking to housekeeping skills. Initially, I tried to be patient, respecting her as an elder, but her constant nitpicking and harsh comments became unbearable. She would insult my cooking, compare me unfavorably to her expectations, and even make hurtful comments about my femininity. One day, after a particularly harsh critique from my mother-in-law, David and I had a severe argument. His response was terrifying. He beat me so brutally that I bled. His screaming and aggression left me in a state of fear, making me wish for a swift end to the violence, even if it meant my own demise. This experience shattered any illusion of a peaceful married life I might have held. The situation you're describing is extremely distressing and concerning. It's important to recognize that no one should ever have to endure violence or abuse in any form. The cycle of abuse you're experiencing, both physical and emotional, is not something to be tolerated or justified. It's crucial to remember that you have the right to live in a safe and respectful environment. Given the severity of the violence you're facing, it's essential to seek immediate help. This could involve reaching out to local authorities, such as the police, especially in instances of physical abuse. Additionally, consider contacting local support services or hotlines that specialize in helping individuals in abusive relationships. These organizations can provide guidance, support, and resources to help you navigate this challenging situation. It's also important to have a support network. This could include trusted family members, friends, or counselors who can provide emotional support and practical advice. Remember, enduring violence and abuse is not a consequence you have to accept for any past actions. You deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Taking steps to protect yourself and seek assistance is not only important but necessary for your well-being. One day, while I was in the yard, I saw someone knocking at the door. When I opened it, two ladies were standing there. I didn't recognize them. They asked if my mother was there, which made me realize they were looking for David's mother. I invited them in and called my mother-in-law, then went to make some tea. From their conversation, I learned they were there as suitors. Eventually, they came as suitors for David's sister, Reza, and their response was positive. They were busy with the engagement and wedding preparations. Every day, mother and daughter were out and about, sometimes accompanied by David. They never asked me to join them. I mostly played the role of a servant, preparing food for them, and if there was any shortcoming, David would create a scene and beat me in front of his mother and sister. I was humiliated every day and said nothing. I remember how David's mother treated me during my own dowry shopping. She dictated what to buy, insisting on branded refrigerators and hand-woven silk carpets. Now, for her daughter, she wasn't listening to anyone and was doing things her way. She didn't provide the same luxury items for her daughter. One day, I overheard that David had paid for all of Reza's dowry, although he hadn't bought essential items like carpets and sound systems for our own home. He would easily cut from our life to spend on his mother and sister. If I objected, it only led to beatings and humiliation. Months after Reza's engagement, her in-laws came for permission for the wedding. The next day, we were busy shopping for clothes, but David didn't consider my needs. He bought himself a suit and never asked if I needed anything. He always only thought of himself. He would tell his mother to ask for money without hesitation, but he never asked if I needed money. Sometimes, I was so hopeless about life that I thought about its end. I didn't even have the courage to die. I returned dejected, sat down, and wept bitterly for myself. David arrived but didn't notice I had been crying. To him, I was invisible. I remember in our first year of marriage, I dyed my hair blonde from black, and he didn't even notice such a big change in me. When David told me to prepare lunch, it was all we ever talked about in a normal state. What's for food? Get up and bring the food. In other states, it was a flood of abuse and beatings. That was how my fate and life were shaped. For Reza's wedding, my family wasn't invited. David's mother didn't send them an invitation card, though she sent it to everyone else, even to distant relatives. But when I mentioned it to David, he lashed out at me so fiercely that I swallowed my words. Life's burdens had become so overwhelming that I couldn't even muster the energy to worry about my brother's life anymore. My mother would tell me how Lucas was making Emma's life miserable. I knew his abrupt and angry behavior was due to unresolved emotional pain. Then, one day, that horrible incident happened. When my mother called, urging me to come quickly, my heart pounded with dread. Arriving there, I found Emma's bloody body in the middle of the living room. The neighbors, having heard gunshots, had called the police. My parents were devastated, and Lucas was explaining to the police that he had seen Emma with a strange man who fled, and in a blind rage, he shot Emma 5 times with an illegally purchased hunting rifle. Their son was crying over his mother's body. I was in shock. When Emma's family arrived, the situation escalated. The police investigation revealed that no one had entered or fled the house. Lucas was taken away again. Emma's mother and sisters were cursing him. They were right. Their lovely daughter had been cruelly murdered by my mentally unstable brother. He not only had blood on his hands from my other brother, but now had wrongfully killed an innocent woman and accused her of infidelity. I wondered how he could concoct such a story for his exoneration. How could he bear to leave his son motherless? On the day of Emma's burial, her father was inconsolable. Everyone was overwhelmed with grief. When they saw me, they screamed and threw me out, understandably. Since then, my parents had been trying to get their forgiveness, but they returned each time insulted and humiliated. My parents visited Emma's father's house every day, seeking forgiveness, but were met with scorn and degradation. Emma's family was unyielding. No one was willing to mediate for us. Our aunts, uncles, and cousins had turned their backs on us. David and Emily's husband were both stubborn, refusing to let us get involved. Several arguments with David over this led to threats, and he warned me against intervening, lest I end up under my criminal brother's fate. Everyone was angry with Lucas, and without their forgiveness, he faced execution. Despite my mother's pleas to Emma's mother and sister, telling them that their daughter wouldn't return and begging them not to let their grandson become fatherless, they wouldn't listen. In January 2019, my brother was executed. I'll never forget that scene. It's been 2 years now. My parents have aged and withered away. Arsalam and Samyar, my brother's legacies, are kept away from us. We've tried to get custody of Samyar, but were met with hostility, blamed for raising a murderer and ruffian. I empathize with Emma's family. She was innocent and loved Lucas deeply. I often saw how she endured beatings but still spoke highly of him to her family. In his confessions, Lucas mentioned how much she begged him not to shoot. As for my own life, it's a mix of good and bad with David. We're more like siblings now. I know he's unfaithful and I'm considering divorce. I plan to take care of my parents and leave this town forever after the divorce. If this thrilling narrative has captivated you, stay tuned for the next video, filled with surprising and astonishing moments, keeping you on the edge between belief and amazement. This isn't just a suggestion, it's an invitation to join an extraordinary adventure.